Let me take this opportunity to share my screen. I hope in a way that's not personally embarrassing. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Jill. I'm humbled and honored to be chatting with all of you this evening. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about what I've come to know about the blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Hold on. To set expectations a little bit as I work through my presentation here. I'm grateful for the introduction that gives some description of my background. I think two key points to take away from my limited resume shared here. My wife actually, she is a reformed engineer and often makes fun of my, in her words, totally useless liberal arts education. Challenging to say that during a Williston call, of course, but I highlight that here because in the context of cryptocurrency and the blockchain, there's so much intricate technical work to make it happen. And very much like the unfrozen caveman lawyer, that stuff frightens and confuses me. And my mind really doesn't get around those kind of technical concepts. So there is a lot of great information out there on the internet to describe those aspects of cryptocurrency, and I've included some resources at the end of the presentation, but just want to set expectations that the extent to which I'll be able to talk about this stuff is really in the context of being an unfrozen caveman lawyer. Secondly, also as probably highlighted by the fact that I just discussed the unfrozen caveman lawyer sketch, you can triangulate from my various graduation dates, basically how old I am. And so I apologize in advance for the limited pop culture reference age of all the stuff that I have in this presentation. I was telling Jill before we got started here, I used to do a similar presentation when I was working at Square and got a lot of feedback that these references make no sense to the younger generation. So if there are any more recent graduates who are unfamiliar with all this stuff, I also apologize in advance. Please take a look at the disclaimer. I mean, it should be pretty straightforward. Even though I'm a lawyer, I am not your lawyer. So, I'm not giving any legal or other financial advice during the course of this presentation. And lastly, Jill was kind to note that I currently live in San Francisco, but I grew up in Hadley. So it's been a very interesting journey that I've taken, and I'm grateful to have started out very close to Williston. And without further ado, let's get started. So before chatting about cryptocurrency and why it's interesting, I thought it might be helpful to describe a little bit what the problem is, why cryptocurrency came into existence. And a lot of it has to do with limitations in the traditional financial system. So if you think about traditionally in the physical economy, how individuals would exchange value, how buyers and sellers would interact, it would be in person. And one of the challenges of our modern life, certainly in the context of COVID-19, where we're all staying at home and just interacting virtually over the internet, is how do we manage commerce when we're not face to face? Traditional finance has made some interesting developments in this regard. For example, banks had the checking account and physical written checks for a long time, and a lot of the way that our traditional economy has historically worked is that in order to intermediate buyers and sellers who might not necessarily be confronting each other at the same time with the good to be bought, with the currency used to buy that good, the way that the traditional economy has solved that problem is through a trusted third party. So, traditionally that's banks, lawyers, escrow agents, that sort of thing. And even in the e-commerce and internet economy, the trusted third party remains ubiquitous. Credit card networks, fintech companies like my former employer Square, all that they're doing in essence is minimizing risk and building trust between buyer and seller. And when this happens to break down, mediating disputes between buyers and sellers. So for anyone who has had their credit card stolen, they're very familiar with the chargeback process, which is essentially how a trusted intermediary manages the disputes that arise between buyers and sellers not receiving the goods or receiving the consideration that they bargained for. So trust is the basis of our traditional financial system, and a lot of folks, I don't necessarily count myself among this group, but believe that trust is very costly, and also that trust is invasive. I mean, I do work for a cryptocurrency company. I guess I'm not so much a cryptocurrency evangelist or cypherpunk in any way, but there is a large population of people that believe very strongly that there are inefficiencies in the trust-based economy, where intermediaries are constantly collecting, validating, and updating information to ensure that buyers and sellers transact with each other on an even footing. So that's kind of the problem statement in many ways that cryptocurrency has attempted to correct. Oh, sorry, let me advance. So what is cryptocurrency? Well, the first cryptocurrency that came into existence is called Bitcoin. I hope and trust some of you have heard of it. And to take a quick step back, one of the goals of establishing Bitcoin and thinking about how to bring about Bitcoin was, how do we abolish trust? So there's a very famous white paper that was released in 2008 under the pseudonym of Satoshi Nakamoto that describes a system of electronic transactions on the internet where you don't need to rely on a trusted third party in the same way that you would in traditional finance. There are kind of, I guess, maybe two principal elements to what makes the Bitcoin network function. The first is, this creation of like a digital asset that's independent of fiat currency. One interesting observation is that everything that I spoke about in the previous slide was about how do we use US dollars. And by using US dollars and putting trust in that value, you're implicitly putting trust in the Federal Reserve System and the United States monetary policy. So part of what was interesting about the development of Bitcoin was, how do we create something that has value, but separate it from even the trust that you need in order to interact with the United States dollar, the world's preeminent reserve currency. So one is this digital coin. And in the Bitcoin network, it's called Bitcoin. And then the second is, how do you establish a trustless mechanism for confirming and transferring the ownership of this new digital asset? One of the challenging things about having a digital item is it's very difficult to confirm once you've given it to someone that you don't just go and give it to someone else if it has some value, right? This is the traditional like double spend problem of digital assets. So, Satoshi Nakamoto and the creators of Bitcoin came up with this peer-to-peer electronic payment system that is based on cryptography, which is really just kind of a fancy word to describe information technology through computers. And it relies on this cryptography instead of a trusted intermediary. There are three sort of principal elements to this trustless system, and we'll go through them. It's the distributed ledger and proof of work, and secure irreversible transactions. As a observation about nomenclature, the reason why Bitcoin and other assets of its kind are known as cryptocurrency is due to the fact that cryptography is used to actually generate and validate all of the transactions that occur on the Bitcoin network. So little aside on where we've come up with the word cryptocurrency. And of course, the reference here is to the dawn of man in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Okay, so how does Bitcoin work? A little flashback here. I originally, in an earlier iteration of this presentation, I'm from Massachusetts, so I love New Kids on the Block. So like, what would have been better than that for a Massachusetts native to introduce the idea of the blockchain? But actually, as I did a little bit more research, this particular song by Jennifer Lopez from, I want to say, the early 2000s, really encapsulates more than you might expect about how the blockchain works. So I'll get to that in a second. One of the interesting developments in cryptocurrency is that instead of relying on this trusted third party to collect and validate information in what is really a centralized ledger, right? So if you think about every time you use your credit card, whenever you enter it into a website online to purchase something over the internet, or even when you use it in person at a coffee shop, the moment you enter that information, it goes and pings the bank that issues your credit card to make sure that you have enough credit to complete the transaction, right? So in essence, your issuing bank, the bank that issues your credit card, holds this ledger that tracks all the transactions you've made and confirms that you have sufficient assets to be able to make the transaction that you're trying to commence. What is unique and what's kind of revolutionary about Bitcoin is that instead of relying on one party to hold this centralized ledger, it distributes this ledger to everyone who participates in the Bitcoin network. That's why often you'll hear about the technology that underlies Bitcoin as the distributed ledger. So that's kind of one of the most powerful innovations here is that in creating this digital asset, in order to prevent double spending, where I might say that I give Alice this asset, and then 2 seconds later, I say that I give Bob the same asset, by giving everyone who participates in the network access to the ledger of the entire history of Bitcoin and all the Bitcoin transactions that have ever been conducted, they can confirm that I have the assets that I say that I do, and that I've only spent it once. So that's one of the great innovations behind the Bitcoin white paper, is this distributed ledger that prevents double spending. A quick note on terminology as we get going. Blocks are essentially like pages of this distributed ledger. Excuse me. Where like each page on the ledger collects and records a bunch of transactions and levels of assets, and blocks is just almost you can imagine page after page you go through the history of the Bitcoin network in the same way you record a series of blocks, each of which links through cryptography to the previous block in the same way that if you're flipping through a ledger, it's bound by a piece of paper to the page that comes before it. So, I will refer back to this quote from J-Lo, used to have a little, now I have a lot. It's almost like she's acquiring Bitcoin, and no matter where I go, I know where I came from. I realized that is in the song actually a reference to where she grew up in the Bronx. But here in the context of Bitcoin, we can think of it as a ledger that tracks, how much she has and where it's come from the very beginning. Because looking at the distributed Bitcoin ledger, you can see the entire history of every transaction that's ever existed. And you'll always know, like J-Lo, where you came from. All right, continuing with my sort of 90s, early 2000s pop references. So how do we write these blocks then? Like, what's the method that decides, who writes this block? Is it me, or is it Alice, or is it Bob? Another one of the innovations in Bitcoin, and the authors of the Bitcoin white paper actually plucked this idea from other information security nerds. It's the concept of proof of work. I realize RuPaul has made a little bit of a pop culture comeback with RuPaul's Drag Race recently. I will always think of RuPaul's hit song Supermodel, where the tagline is "You better work." And that's, I think, one way to remember who gets the right to add another block to this growing list of transactions, to this electronic ledger. Essentially, and this is one area, again, where I really don't want to get over my skis in terms of technical discussion, but I will try my best to explain this. Proof of work is, it's essentially a competition between various members of this peer-to-peer Bitcoin network. And it's a specific kind of competition based on the use of computing power. This computing power race is called mining. It kind of derives from the historical comparisons in the early Bitcoin era to Bitcoin being somewhat like digital gold. So that's one of the terms of art here, is that in computing this proof of work, which it's similar to, for example, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100, and you have absolutely no idea what that number is. And so the best way to try to find that is to go through, okay, is it 1? No. Is it 2? No. Is it 3? No. And at some point, you're going to have expended a certain amount of work, and you will have ultimately guessed my number. Proof of work for Bitcoin is a similar concept, where users on the network who, on the distributed peer-to-peer network, they all have their own computers and their own computing power. They will solve a similar but exponentially and cryptographically more challenging problem. And whoever solves it first is able to write the next block in the chain. And the difficulty of this problem actually automatically corrects over time. It's kind of neat. The computers that are trying to do the mining now are leagues better than they were when Bitcoin was first launched, almost 10 years ago. But there is an automatic sort of recalibration of the frequency with which blocks are created, and it happens about every 10 minutes or so. So to sum up, miners, they're competing to collect all the transactions that users are sharing on the network, and the first to solve complex computational problem writes these transactions to the block. The reason why miners do this is that for every block that they write into the blockchain, they receive a reward of 6.25 Bitcoin. I forget what the closing price of Bitcoin is today, but that's like, some good chunk of change going out to a miner every 10 minutes or so. And I hope that, by seeing this block by block record of transactions and assets, it also helps to show how Bitcoin eliminates this double spend problem. Part of the reason for that is that, once a miner successfully solves this problem, in order to change the information that sits in this completed block, you have to actually do the problem over again. And when more blocks are added onto that last block, you have to redo all the work that comes after it as well. So it becomes computationally like impractical to try to go back and edit or change anything in the blockchain that already exists, because you have all these people who are still competing to write new blocks to add to the chain, and it's computationally almost impossible. So because each of the blocks contains this perfect record of all the transactions that have occurred, and there's no way to change it, this is what creates some confidence in the Bitcoin network that the ledger that's distributed among all members of the network is in fact accurate and accurately represents who owns what. So another way that we eliminate the double spend problem. So a natural question here is, how do you know who owns what in the ledger? This is actually determined by another cryptographic principle called public key cryptography. And once again, I'll do my best to try to explain it without getting too over my skis with my, as my wife says, useless liberal arts degree. But maybe I guess before I dive into that, it's worth talking about like where Bitcoin lives. So, Bitcoin are assets, and they are sort of inseparable from the Bitcoin ledger, from the Bitcoin network, which really at the end of the day is just a long series of transactions that are recorded, and there are certain amounts of value, of Bitcoin value, attached to these various parts of the ledger. So Bitcoin is allocated to different public addresses that appear in this long chain of transactions. And these public addresses are called public keys. What a public key is, it's a sort of long series of symbols and digits that are mathematically and cryptographically derived from something that is called a private key. And a private key is similarly long sequence of digits that someone keeps private, whereas the public key is sort of like your public Bitcoin address that you can share with anyone in the network. So the best analogy that I've come up with here to try to explain this, at least to myself, and as a lawyer, I find that basic household analogies are best for my own understanding, is the public key is sort of like a clear and transparent, but perfectly secure locked mailbox, such that you can see what is inside the mailbox with perfect clarity, and you can also put whatever you want in the mailbox. So if I were to have for example Jill's public key, I could put any amount of Bitcoin that I wanted into her mailbox. But the private key is akin to, or is analogous to, the key that you need to open your public key, the key that you need to be able to open up your clear, secure mailbox and take assets out. And the way that we are assured that the owner of the underlying assets associated with a public key has confirmed a transaction and that it's not otherwise fraudulent is that the private key is the only thing that you can use to digitally sign or otherwise withdraw Bitcoin from a particular address. So that's really, I think, ultimately the most powerful and actually the most potentially dangerous thing in the cryptocurrency universe is keeping this particular piece of information, this private key, secret, because there's unlike traditional finance where you reveal certain aspects of your identity, like when you get a credit card, it's like your name, your date of birth, maybe some part of your social security number, your address. In Bitcoin and in cryptocurrency, all that you have is your private key, and you can derive any number of public keys from that using a cryptographic hash. So the private key is the most important piece of information, and if lost, if you lose your private key, then it's gone forever, and there's no way to get it back. So I refer to one of my favorite movies series of all time, as well as one of my favorite book series of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Very much like the One Ring, when Gandalf rides off to Gondor and Frodo is left in his hobbit hole. Keep it secret, keep it safe. That's the most important thing you can do with your private key. A word about wallets. So for anyone who has read about cryptocurrency, you'll often hear this word wallet used a lot. And just as a matter of terminology, when you own, as I mentioned before, when you own Bitcoin on the blockchain, what you actually own is your private key. That's the most important thing. And the place where you store your private key is typically known as your wallet. And there are different ways that you can secure your private key in different kinds of wallets. Just want to make clear that wallets are not where you ultimately store your Bitcoin. As I mentioned before, Bitcoin is kind of inextricably linked to the ledger. And so the distributed ledger is really where your Bitcoin lives, and wallets are where you take measures to store your private key. One of the things that I've learned from my dabbling in information security is as a result of learning about different kinds of wallets, the most interesting one for me being the cold wallet that is not connected to the internet. What does that mean? Basically, like you've written down your password on a piece of paper somewhere, or you've written down your public key on a piece of paper somewhere. The founders of my company, Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, they have a funny story about when they first invested in Bitcoin. They tore up a piece of paper that had their private key written on it and stored it, parts of the piece of paper in like 12 different banks located all over the country because they wanted to protect it so much. That's why I don't store any passwords online. I keep all my passwords in maybe not that safe, a goofy little book that says, here are Niels' passwords. So if you break into my house, then you can get my cold wallet with all my passwords, but I'm assuming that's probably not gonna happen. But anyway, that's one word about wallets and private keys. And once again, importantly, if you lose your private key, there's no way to get it back. And accordingly, like a significant percentage of Bitcoin in the world is estimated to be lost because people have lost track of their private keys. So quick recap, just again how it works. I won't read through it, but this is just a distillation of what the technology underlying Bitcoin looks like, how the blockchain works. One important point mentioned here at the end, miners will look at the longest chain to be the correct one. So that makes sense, because as soon as a new block is added, miners will go back to competing and will want to ensure that the chain with the longest work and with the greatest amount of work committed to it is the one that they continue to extend. So that's just one thing that further supports what I was saying before about the lack of the double spend problem in the Bitcoin network. So what can we use the blockchain for? I mean, I think primarily there are a lot of interesting cryptocurrencies that have been created, and as mentioned at the bottom of this slide here, there are a lot of cryptocurrency exchanges like the one that I happen to work for, but also other exchanges like Coinbase and Kraken, where you can go and purchase cryptocurrencies for yourself. There are lots of other interesting uses of the blockchain as well. I mean, some things that pop to mind about how the blockchain can really efficiently and effectively be used is in the context of record keeping. So I've listed some interesting companies here that have been involved in fun blockchain projects. For example, in the context of medical records, if you manage to store medical record information that you can only unlock with your private key that's distributed in the blockchain, a lot of people think this can be a tremendously efficient way to track medical records over time. Similarly with like supply chain management, and also in the context of like authentic luxury goods, LVMH has a kind of neat blockchain project where they track authentically made non-counterfeit luxury goods through the blockchain. Pretty neat. Actually, my personal favorite up here, I buried it a little bit in the list, but it's actually a portfolio company of the company where I work. It's called Nifty Gateway. A really interesting idea about creating digital art and showing provenance through the blockchain, where artists will create a limited number of pieces of non-fungible art that are written into the blockchain. These are otherwise known as CryptoKitties, if people are familiar with that. But it's kind of a new modern way of creating and consuming and confirming the authenticity of a piece of art. And I think that's a really neat project. If anyone is interested in learning more about it, I would encourage you to check it out. So one of the, I think maybe the most interesting use of blockchain and sort of the distributed ledger technology comes from this cryptocurrency network that's called Ethereum. Ether is the sort of native cryptocurrency on the Ethereum blockchain. And it's, I think, one of the largest in the world. Ether is the second largest cryptocurrency in the world. And Ethereum is by far and away the most heavily used blockchain in the world. The principal reason for that is that Ethereum uses another technology called smart contracts, which are essentially automatically executing sort of contractual promises that are memorialized in a computer program. Some of the ways in which smart contracts are used are, for example, a lot of companies have created what are known as fiat-backed stablecoins. What this means is that if you go on to, for example, my company Gemini has a stablecoin called the Gemini dollar. If you go onto the Gemini website and purchase one Gemini dollar token, there is a smart contract that executes in the background on the Ethereum network that automatically will take the dollar that you put onto the Gemini platform and will transfer it to a safe safe bank account. I think that sits at State Street in Boston. So the smart contract then is used, like as soon as you create this token, it automatically deposits a dollar in a separate safe bank account, such that you have like this sort of dollar collateralized coin that you can use as a real dollar in the context of internet commerce and blockchain commerce. As soon as you put that dollar back onto the Gemini platform, the same smart contract kind of runs in reverse, and the dollar from State Street plops back down into your account on Gemini, and you get your dollar back. So there are lots of contractual relationships that can be used in this way through smart contracts and kind of automated computer programming. There are some examples here. One of the more interesting ones is that the deposit, what is DTC? Deposit Trust and Clearing Corporation in New York. They use smart contracts to settle certain financial products, in particular, credit default swaps. So you can imagine if two parties enter into a credit default swap and the default actually occurs, instead of relying on like a team of faceless lawyers to move the money that you're owed as a result of the swap to the buyer, it just happens automatically and it's settled automatically through the blockchain. So a lot of really interesting ways that smart contracts can be used, and some of the interesting examples are listed out here. One that is very close to my heart as a reformed corporate lawyer is shareholder rights in the context of a company. So the Delaware General Corporation Law, interestingly, a few years ago, clarified that you can issue shares of a Delaware corporation on the blockchain. And as a young M&A lawyer, I spent so many hours trying to reconcile, capitalization tables with investments and investor rights and all this kind of nonsense to go through an M&A deal. Imagine if you could release records to the blockchain and power it with smart contracts such that if certain corporate events occur, the rights that are owed to certain shareholders automatically turn on, or certain things automatically happen through the blockchain. Really interesting idea. No one has yet done it, but I've pitched this to a couple of different folks and no one's bid on it yet, but I think it's a really neat idea, and some folks are assuredly thinking about it somewhere. So I've spoken a lot about trust in the context of this presentation, and a lot of the companies, I'm self-conscious of the fact that a lot of the things that I just mentioned, there really is still a trusted entity that's sitting between you and whatever you're trying to do with the blockchain. So, very much, this is my second Princess Bride reference, only because it's my favorite movie of all time. I keep on using that word trust. Does it mean what I think it means? From that perspective, I think, it's important to recognize that, like I was talking about before, the blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, they're incredibly powerful, but they're also anonymous. And they're also, if you don't take the appropriate precautions, they are very susceptible to being hacked. Like there have been very well-known hacks of very prominent cryptocurrency exchanges because the appropriate precautions around information security and protecting your private keys in the appropriate wallet were not taken. So in that respect, I sort of look at access to this trusted network similarly to maybe going to the dentist. I mean, I think it's possible that I could clean my own teeth or even remove one of my own teeth, but I think it's probably much better, and I would have a much better outcome if I trust a professional who's going to help me do it. That's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's one that's worth mentioning in this context because I spoke at such length about the lack of trust of this system, and yet a lot of the interesting companies like Coinbase, Kraken, and my own company, Gemini, really trade on trust because, as I mentioned before, it involves a lot of interesting and to me kind of inaccessible cryptographic knowledge to really be able to access this this new and emerging asset class in a meaningful way. So in order to help people do that, people like you and me and my mother, a lot of companies like Gemini and Coinbase and Kraken, and similarly PayPal and Square have provided on-ramps into this new asset class so people can participate in it without internalizing the burden of doing so safely. So just thought I'd throw out that little bit of a plug maybe for the place where I used to work and the place where I currently work. So I'm a lawyer. I hate to admit it because I really think I'm a great guy, but I thought I would say a couple words about the law and sort of how the law tends to approach cryptocurrency. I mean, given the number of things that I just chatted about, stable coins and different kinds of cryptocurrency, different kinds of smart contracts, it's really challenging, and I think this is one thing that a lot of government regulators have blundered into. It's tough to capture all of cryptocurrency under one set of rules. And I think you'll see reflected in the way that the United States approaches cryptocurrency regulation. What the United States has done and what a lot of other jurisdictions have done is they'll try to bite off different pieces of the cryptocurrency universe based on the underlying subject matter. So, the IRS was one of the first US regulators to take a stance on how to treat cryptocurrency, and it was very basic. They said, cryptocurrency is property, meaning it can be taxed. So if you go to Coinbase or if you go to Gemini after this and buy cryptocurrency now and sell it for a tremendous profit at some point in the future, the IRS will tax you. But beyond that, the other relevant US regulators have taken an approach that doesn't extend too far outside of their own regulatory perimeter. So, for example, Bitcoin and Ether in the eyes of the SEC are very much not securities. But for those of us who remember the kind of initial coin offering mania of 2017, the SEC did deem that a lot of other cryptocurrencies could be securities. A lot of other cryptocurrencies could be securities that were offered at that time. So it's possible, and you've seen a lot more enforcement action from the SEC recently against unregistered securities offerings. For new cryptocurrencies that are emerging in the blockchain space. Same with CFTC. They've said that the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, they've said that Bitcoin and Ether are commodities, and as such, derivatives and financial products based off of Bitcoin and Ether are regulated by the CFTC. There are different state-by-state approaches as well. New York, interestingly, that's where my company is headquartered. New York has a cryptocurrency specific set of rules and regulations, often known as the bit regulation. Those are, or the bit license. So some US states consider cryptocurrency and related transactions to be money transmission that are governed by state banking departments. A lot of other states don't. So there's, even among the state level, there's not a lot of consistency. Looking outside of the United States, most of Europe doesn't really touch cryptocurrency at all, except to the extent that it can be deemed a security. So there are certain kinds of cryptocurrencies that look more like securities than others based on their properties, and those tend to be captured by existing securities regulators. But stuff like Bitcoin and Ether and more established cryptocurrencies that are less security-like fall outside of that regulatory purview altogether. Probably the most important two issues that the law confronts are, anti-money laundering, sort of fraud prevention, and anti-terrorist financing. So that, because cryptocurrencies are inherently anonymous, to the extent that those cryptocurrencies are used and transferred to buy or to trade for US dollars, the US government gets very concerned about that. So for a very long time, cryptocurrency exchanges have been subject to the United States Bank Secrecy Act, which requires sort of source of wealth and identity verification. And this is something that is consistent for a lot of cryptocurrency exchanges, even if their underlying products are unregulated altogether. The people who come onto your exchange to mess around and play in this new asset class are almost always subject to these kind of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing concerns. And then consumer protection. That's one of the big issues that the government is confronted with, because a lot of people were caught by unscrupulous, anonymous cryptocurrency companies, and the government really wants to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. So where do we go from here? I don't have any really good answers to some of these questions, but the future is going to be an interesting place for cryptocurrency. I sort of tend to believe that we're in the GeoCities and Yahoo phase. I like to analogize to the early internet. Cryptocurrency exchanges are sort of like the GeoCities and Yahoo of the early internet. And at some point, someone is going to come up with a really game-changing technology that rests, or a game-changing solution that rests on the blockchain as its technology. Some things that people are talking about, my friends Cameron and Tyler are very bullish on Bitcoin replacing gold as a hedge against inflation. And, they're also very bullish on, the use of cryptocurrency to empower the economically underempowered in the developing world. So these are areas where I think a lot of Bitcoin maximalists are looking for development in the future. I've talked for an incredibly long time. And so now I would like to pause and take a drink of water and, thank you everyone for listening to me drone on like this for so long. And please let me know if you have any questions.
So, Niels, if you could exit your...
Oh my, yes.
I can bring us all back together. And I think that we're gonna take you off of this and make you just one of all of us. So thank you for that. That was so interesting. And I feel so much smarter. I will confess that my interest in understanding more about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin came from reading a Vanity Fair article last year about the
There you go.
Robberies in Iceland, where because of the geothermal power, there are huge cryptocurrency mines and people were stealing the literal computers. And I thought, what do you mean? So this has been really helpful for me in contextualizing that. And I feel like I understand the product a bit more. I know that we did have some questions from people who had put them in earlier. So if I would go to those two people first, and I know we have a third person waiting to ask. So if Jory Berkowitz, are you still on the call with us? And if you are, you could unmute and ask your question. Jory, are you still here? I'm checking the list. All right. Well, other people may have had this same question. So, and you, I think, touched upon it. What Jory had been asking was, how risky are cryptocurrencies as investments? And I think because they're not like a gold standard, they're not attached to a physical thing. The blockchain and the ledger are intangible, can't hold them.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think risky as investments, risky as investments. So I would say from that standpoint, in the various terms of service that I've drafted as a lawyer at the two companies where I've been involved with Bitcoin, we're very straightforward about the risks due to the volatility of the asset. The volatility comes from a few different areas, I think. Notably, and I actually didn't mention this in the presentation, there is a fixed quantity of Bitcoin that exists in the world. At the end of the day, when Bitcoin mining ceases, there will be a limit of 21 million Bitcoin ever. So kind of dissimilar to the way that the Federal Reserve can influence sort of dollar value stability through monetary policy, those sorts of levers don't exist for Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is it's a much less mature asset than a lot of other assets with longer financial histories have. It's pretty challenging to be able to short Bitcoin, and so it's difficult to obtain good price discovery, or can be difficult to obtain good price discovery in that regard. So part of the volatility comes from, and the inherent risk then of investing in Bitcoin comes from just the youth of the asset. One of the things that we're trying to do at Gemini is build around the cryptocurrency community more sophisticated financial tools that we take for granted in the traditional financial world, that lead to better price discovery, that lead to sort of more consistency in the price of the asset, and that over time will sort of create a sophistication around this new emerging digital asset class. Like, frankly, it doesn't really exist there yet. So in short, yes, for a short-term investor, my personal belief is that there is some risk given volatility. However, then you look over the lifetime of Bitcoin, where it was worth mere cents a few years ago, and now is worth multiple tens of thousands of dollars, the trajectory certainly looks attractive to a lot of longer horizon investors.
So, okay, thank you. And that's actually funny. People are entering here in the chat.
Yeah, I saw some pop up.
Bitcoin closed today at 18,303. So yeah. That leads us to our next question. And Caroline, I think you're here if you want to unmute and ask your question, which I think feels great.
Hi, I'm Caroline. Thanks for coming. I was kind of wondering if you think that Bitcoin has the kind of likelihood of becoming a bubble. I'm a junior in college right now, and I'm taking an economic crises course. So whenever there's kind of a lack of confidence, there can tend to be a economic crisis. So I was just wondering if you think that that could happen with Bitcoin, or if Bitcoin is might be a speculative bubble.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think thanks, Caroline. That's a really shrewd question. I think a lot of folks in 2017, when I admit that was the first time that I became really aware of and involved with Bitcoin. The President Jack Dorsey, probably more famously known as being the founder of Twitter, when I was working at Square, was very bullish on getting into Bitcoin in 2017, and the price at that time was sort of similar to now, just absolutely going crazy, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my gosh, is this like tulip mania like it was, I forget, in Amsterdam in like the 17th?" You know this, I'm sure you studied a lot more recently than I have. I think the price went up in 2017 to a very strong high of like kind of where it is now, around $19,000, and then it regressed and was below $10,000 for a significant period of time. So a lot of people looked at that and said, see, there was a bubble. People went home for Thanksgiving. Then around Christmas, the bubble peaked, and then it came back to reality for like the next period of time. I think so. That's certainly one point of view. Another point of view, and I will admit I'm choosing these words carefully to not personally endorse one or the other. Like the founders of my company, Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, they firmly believe that Bitcoin, because it's taken a lot of investment away from gold as a hedge against inflation, and because there's an inherent limit to the amount of Bitcoin that can exist in the world, which really is true with respect to no other asset that we typically use, whether it's a fiat currency or a commodity to hedge against inflation. They firmly believe that Bitcoin is going to be worth $500,000. They've said so publicly. They've justified it publicly. That's their contention. I think Jack Dorsey also, he firmly believes that Bitcoin is going to be the currency of the internet. That when we move away from using US dollars, who knows when this is going to happen, but that Bitcoin will be the currency of transactions on the internet. And that's part of the reason why he ensured that on the retail facing Cash App, that users who otherwise might not have access to financial services are able to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin. That's also why at Square, just in the past year, he had the company invest $50 million into Bitcoin, because he views it as a hedge against inflation. So there are a lot of Bitcoin maximalists, and there are a lot of Bitcoin alarmists. And I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle there. It's kind of a shabby, like wishy-washy lawyer answer, but that's the best one I can give.
Okay, and if anybody else has questions, just put in the chat that you have a question so I can know to recognize you and ask you to unmute. But early on in the conversation, Hal jumped in, and Hal, I think if you still have a question, now's a good time to unmute and ask.
Do you have a view as to which cryptocurrency has the most longevity? Do you think like Bitcoin has more longevity or Ethereum? Especially since with cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, there's like a team behind it that updates the cryptocurrency.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't really have a strong personal view. I think what makes Bitcoin attractive, I think, in terms of longevity, is it was the first and it's the biggest, right? So there is some kind of first mover effect that I think really works well for Bitcoin. I look at some very much wealthier than I am individuals like Jack and like Cameron and like Tyler, who are personally invested, and their companies are personally invested in seeing Bitcoin succeed. Not for the least of which because they're both personally heavily invested in Bitcoin. So I think there is a good first mover advantage. I think for Ether and Ethereum, like what makes Ethereum so strong, and why I think actually as a network it will continue to exist forever, is its ubiquity. I mean, everyone uses Ethereum. All of the new projects that are coming online are happening as ERC20 tokens on the Ethereum blockchain. And in that regard, because Ether is the sort of native currency of the Ethereum network, if you want to, for example, set up a non-fungible token business and power it with Ether and have people buy non-fungible art using something that already aligns with the ERC20 tokens that you're using, Ether is just such a convenient way to do that. So I think, in my mind, Bitcoin and Ether are the top two, and everyone else is trying to catch up.
Okay, thank you. Dave Dibble, you have a question, so if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, am I in? Okay. A question about the amount of electricity used for mining.
Oh my, yeah.
And whether that is sustainable in the long term. I work for Ripple Labs, by the way.
Oh, cool. Well, a fellow crypto nerd. I'm very, very happy to hear.
Tech writer. I'm working on the API docs right now.
Oh, very nice. Well, I would have expected you to correct all of the technical inaccuracies in what I just talked about. So very happy for your discretion not to totally blow me up.
I was just wondering who J-Lo is.
Right. Yeah, I know, that's devastating. That your point is a fair one, and I think there's a reason why a lot of crypto miners are trying to relocate to the sort of lowest cost, and I think perhaps as we become more focused on environmental and sort of climate change issues, to more environmentally friendly ways of mining. So, Jill, to your point from the Vanity Fair article, there's a good reason why Iceland has become a good location for a lot of cryptocurrency miners, because geothermal heat is a very inexpensive way to create electricity that occurs naturally. And the air is very cold there and very good for cooling servers. So if you want to mine as efficiently as possible and have the least amount of environmental impact, which I think a lot of the cryptocurrency community is beginning to internalize a little bit, I think that you will, or I'm maybe not comfortable predicting this, but I hope that miners will think about the most efficient, both from an environmental and an economic standpoint, the most efficient way of mining, and I think you've already started to see that happen.
Okay, Elizabeth, your question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize that I'm going to dumb this down a little bit, but to be fair, I feel like I've been barely holding on to a PhD level conversation about something I know very little about. So my first question.
Shoot.
Does Bitcoin get used like in a store to buy a product of any sort?
You can. One of the links that I provided in the presentation is for a company called Flexa, and they've created a mobile app that is powered by cryptocurrency, such that you can go. I'm actually not. I should know more about this. I actually know the guys there pretty well, but you can go into a store that has the Flexa app. You have the Flexa app on your phone, you touch it to their kind of register, and you can use Bitcoin to buy, a loaf of bread from Whole Foods or a cup of coffee from Starbucks. So it is used. Admittedly, one of the challenges in using Bitcoin for payments is that because of the way the blocks are written and the frequency at which they're written, the number of transactions that can occur in a short period of time is actually pretty low. so I think it was Dave was the name of the gentleman who's from Ripple. Ripple has some really fantastic and interesting products that are also based on the blockchain that can conduct payments and money transfers in particular much more quickly and much more rapidly than Bitcoin, which is a little bit more plodding in terms of how the blocks are written.
Okay,
Is that
was a way more sophisticated answer than what I was actually trying to get at. I really want to dumb it down for myself to understand what is Bitcoin used for? Is it just this nebulous concept like putting money in a bank or investing in a stock? I mean, with a stock, you're investing in a company. What is, very simply put, what is Bitcoin used for?
I would say the majority of people who buy Bitcoin do it for speculative purposes. They think.
So they're buying and trading like they would gold or silver.
Yeah, they're buying or trading. Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people see it as a store of value. I mean, it can, as I mentioned, like technically be used for a lot of different things, including payments. But I think the overwhelming majority of people who buy Bitcoin do so because they believe it's a store of value that will appreciate over time.
Okay, so the next question, now that I understand it a little bit better, is what happens if electricity goes away? Just like the stock market or banks that are digitally holding your dollar amount. Basically, Bitcoin, poof, gone, right?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, Bitcoin exists in, I guess, to your question, if all electricity vanished everywhere in the world, then in the same way that, our traditional financial system would evaporate, a lot of Bitcoin. I think this is actually an area where I admit, as an unfrozen caveman lawyer, I may be over my skis. My impression, without knowing more, and once again, I open it up to our friend from Ripple if he has a different answer. But my impression is that because the ledger is stored in databases, that if the electricity that powers the memory of those databases goes away for a significant period of time, that all that memory is lost. Then in the same way that all of our traditional dollar financial system would evaporate, Bitcoin would also evaporate. But I'm not 100% sure about that. There might be other protections that are built in there that I just don't know about. But
okay, and then
if electricity vanishes for that long, we have many more significant problems than the lack of Bitcoin.
I understand. So in terms of hacking, I understand there's tons and tons of security built around it. But is it similar to, let's say somebody hacked into Bank of America? Is it like that, where somebody eventually will figure out how to hack into Bitcoin, and then what?
Good question. So as I perhaps maybe too complicatedly tried to describe, it's impossible to hack Bitcoin, right? So it's computationally impossible to try to rewrite Bitcoin, and instead of me having 1 Bitcoin at my public address, give that Bitcoin to you without my permission. That is essentially impossible. Where cryptocurrency hacks do occur is somebody steals my private key that allows them to unlock the cryptocurrency bucket that I have and take all my cryptocurrency away from me without my authorization. So that is actually, has happened. There have been some very high profile cases of that happening in the past, for sure.
And then did the people get their Bitcoin back? Is there some kind of NDIC or something?
Unlike the traditional financial system, where if I were to somehow steal your Chase Bank login information and go into Chase Bank and take money out of your account and put it into my account, that's very easily traceable, right? Because someone saw that I took it. What makes the security of your private key so important in the context of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is that it's transferred somewhere and no one's name is attached to it, right? So if I go and I manage to steal your private key and take your Bitcoin away from you, there's no way for you to get it back.
Wow.
So on that note, and being conscious of the time, We have another question coming in. So Nathan, do you want to unmute and ask?
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Niels. The presentation was great, particularly for a dinosaur like me. I'm trying to grasp the basic concept. People have compared Bitcoin to an alternate investment to gold.
Yeah.
So gold to me is simple: supply and demand and balance creates value. So my fundamental question is what makes Bitcoin, using that as an example, a limited product? Somewhere in your presentation, I think you mentioned there's only 21 million Bitcoins out there. Billion, excuse me. That's me and my hearing.
No, million. You were right. 21 million.
The blockchain originally was a self-generated concept. Why can't that just be expanded on, linked on, other cryptocurrencies added to it? What makes Bitcoin, as an example, a limited product that creates a supply and demand imbalance that creates big value?
To your question as to the amount of Bitcoin that can be created, that's just what the underlying program, and it's all open source. And this is once again where I am out over my skis a little bit. This is the program that underlies the Bitcoin project. There's a limit of 21 million Bitcoin that can be created. That's just, it was supposed to be a limited product that is released over a period of time. I think the last Bitcoin is expected to be mined in 2140 or something like that, 100 odd years from now. And that is just the design of this product. And many people believe that it was intentional because having a limited product makes it less susceptible to the traditional tools of monetary policy that could affect the very supply and demand that now largely determines the price of what Bitcoin is exchangeable for in US dollars or other currency.
What keeps Bitcoin from issuing more coins? I know Bitcoin, it doesn't exist as an entity. It's a system. It's a series of locked-in transactions. But can it be manipulated and created more?
I'm not the best person to speak about how changes to the underlying programming work. What I understand is that 21 million is the limit, full stop, and that's part of the underlying programming language for the asset. Whether it could be amended or there are a lot of sort of consensus-based things that can happen on a distributed network of this kind, like what can be done to change or amend Bitcoin. I actually sort of shrug my shoulders and plead some ignorance there from a technical perspective. I apologize.
Thank you again for the presentation. It was outstanding.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It was great to chat with you.
So does last call for questions here, being conscious of time, we've kept everyone a little bit longer, but this is so interesting. And while I'm waiting for anyone who might want to type something, I'll ask a question. When we talk about, in this presentation, you've talked about Bitcoin in dollars. If we were in France, would we be talking about this Bitcoin in euro? And since it was by a Japanese person, do they talk about it in yen?
Yeah, and there are different exchanges that are operating in different countries that will, have different trading pairs for Bitcoin or for Ether or for any other kind of cryptocurrency. So, yeah, I mean, it's easy to assess the value based on a commonly understood reference currency, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. There are some interesting Bitcoin projects, cryptocurrency projects that will tokenize different things like slivers of a real estate investment, or which have their own value, or different buckets of commodities. Libra, I forget what Libra, the Facebook Libra project is now called, DM, I think, which is they're trying to bring together a bucket of different reference currencies to ascribe value to this underlying token. So yeah, the world is your oyster when it comes to how you try to describe the value.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was asking because to Liz's point, the thing that I learned about it was someone paid for a vacation in Costa Rica with Bitcoin. That is what they use to transact their surfing vacation. So
I was just reading about a family that made an early investment in Bitcoin, and they've been living off their proceeds of that for like the last however many years. One of the things that I follow on Twitter is like the cryptoverse on Twitter. So a lot of the stuff I see on Twitter is like goofy crypto stuff, and this heartwarming story of a family of 5 traveling to Turkey and living in Europe and doing this and that because they made an early investment in Bitcoin. So yeah, it's totally possible.
We've got 3 more questions, so we'll run through these quickly. Mario, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Niels. Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 unrelated questions, but the first was, I was wondering what your take on Bitcoin forks is, and forking into things like Bitcoin Cash and other possible upcoming forks. And also, I was wondering a little bit, I know as people have used Bitcoin to pay for things like vacation, Bitcoin is taxed as property, which makes it a little more complicated. So some of your views on the taxation policies around that.
Well, let me take, forks, I guess maybe I'll take that first. I don't have a particularly strong feeling about various forks and sort of the consensus mechanisms that surround them. For everyone else, a fork is essentially, a split in the chain, such that instead of having a single block after block, at some point there will be a separate chain that splits off, and it can be for technical reasons or philosophical reasons or like cypherpunk philosophical reasons that these happen. Typically they're often technical, and this is once again an area where I don't have a particularly strong feeling given my unfrozen caveman lawyer approach to this technology. With respect to taxation, I mean, I don't have any particularly strong views about taxation. I guess, a lot of people who are involved in the crypto community, I think, tend to be a little, especially the like cypherpunks, tend to be a little bit more anarchist than I do. As an officer of the court and a lawyer, I think there is a feeling that it may not necessarily make sense to tax something that predominantly exists outside of the protection or involvement of any government entity. So from that perspective, I think a lot of folks don't appreciate taxation of this asset that otherwise doesn't rely on any of the typical protections that governments typically will use in order to justify taxation. That having been said, I've actually never sold any cryptocurrency, so the taxation has never applied to me. I'm long on it, so maybe I will feel similarly when I go to sell at some point in the future. But I guess it seems kind of it doesn't seem totally unreasonable to tax your earnings from Bitcoin, although everyone who purchases Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency does so with post-tax dollars already. So a lot of people sort of believe that taxation of the gains you get from cryptocurrency are kind of like unfair double taxation, but that is certainly a political discussion that I'm not prepared to have or really to take a side on, but I appreciate the question.
I appreciate you're getting the answers. I was thinking more in terms of just everyday usage, because obviously if you store, then you're subject to long-term or short-term. But if you go to like the grocery store, you're not being taxed on the sales tax. So just from a more practical daily usage perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not really sure like how that works. I've never been close enough to it to have to think, or maybe more accurately, I've never worked at a company that uses cryptocurrency specifically for like retail transactions. So I've never had to figure out how to make like the capital gain taxation of the underlying cryptocurrency work in the context of like, small dollar retail sales. So I'm not actually sure what happens there, like what the tax impact is. So another thing for me to try to learn.
Thank you. I appreciate you answering the questions, and thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, no, thanks for your questions. I appreciate it.
Okay, I think 2 more questions, and we're keeping you a little over, Niels. Is this okay?
No, it's fine. It's 5:45 on the West Coast, so I'm not. It's not even. It's maybe just barely Miller time, but
All right.
yeah, this is totally okay.
So Jason, you're next.
Jason, I think you're muted. Oh,
sorry. Would there ever be a time when cryptocurrencies are mainstream, where it's going through banks and payments, and maybe to the point where we're making donations to Williston in Bitcoin or one of the similar ones?
I think that is the vision, and I sort of glossed over in the interest of time the sort of slide in here that talks about the future. But I think once again, I'll parrot my friends and founders of Gemini a little bit. Cameron and Tyler very strongly believe, and this is part of the reason why they established their company in New York, very close to Wall Street, is that at some point, institutions, you're starting to see this happen a little bit. Like you're seeing, like when I was at Square and we put Bitcoin into the Cash App, that was like the first public company ever that had any exposure to or involvement with Bitcoin. And now you're seeing, JP Morgan has created their own like crypto. Actually, a former colleague of mine from Gemini is heading up this sort of cryptocurrency and distributed ledger team within JP Morgan. I think they're releasing their like own JP Morgan coin of some kind. So I think you're beginning to see as Bitcoin and Ether and a lot of the other tokens that exist on the Ethereum blockchain and elsewhere have more longevity and have persisted for such a long period of time that people like Jack Dorsey and companies like Square and companies like JP Morgan are starting to mess around in this space a little bit more. A lot of people in the cryptocurrency community are very, very hopeful that what you described will come to be the case in the future, although there are admittedly just as many skeptics on the other side of the coin who, to an earlier question, think that it might be a fad and will peter out and become nothing in the fullness of time. So I think my own personal belief, as I kind of mentioned before, is that I think that the underlying technology, the distributed ledger, there is something there. There is a there, and someone at some point will build the next great Google or the next great Amazon or the next great Uber using this technology, and we're all just kind of like holding our breath waiting for it to happen.
Hearing you mentioned one of the prominent banks, gives it a little more credibility for where it might go than just other little startups that get big on this.
Yeah, that's certainly the hope, and I think one of the challenges to that will be also once big institutions like JP Morgan or even it started to happen a little bit on the fringes. Certain investment advisors and hedge funds they want to invest a portion of their holdings in Bitcoin, but once pension funds and other types of entities like that start playing around in the cryptocurrency space, then you're going to see government step in and want to do something about it, create more certainty, more transparency, more rules. So it'll be really interesting to see what that interplay looks like. If we get to the world of Bitcoin maximality that you just described, the government surely is going to want to step in and look at it a little bit more closely, I can imagine.
So on that note, I do not think we could have asked for a better segue into what will be the last question of the night. And Caroline, I'm sorry, yours came in just under the wire, but we're going to go to Holly and go ahead.
Oh, division of banks. I feel like I'm going to be in trouble.
Holly, do you want to unmute and?
Sure, I'll read it. Hey, Niels, thank you for the presentation. So, two-part question. Regulators try to create policy that encourages innovation and also discourages illicit financial transactions. What can we regulators do better from a policy perspective?
I think that's a really good question, and thank you for asking. I think one of the challenges for cryptocurrency that I kind of alluded to is it's really hard to know. And actually, frankly, this is part of what makes it really exciting to be a lawyer in this space. Is it's hard to know what to do. because it's an emerging asset class, and there's really not a lot of precedent when it comes to what we're supposed to do. So in the context of state banking departments, I think one thing that has we've sort of overcome this at my current company, and also similarly in the past when I was working at Square in the context of payment processing is, one of the big challenges for a company who wants to offer a nationwide product is how do we engage with states to bring a new kind of technology into a patchwork of existing rules and regulations that when they were written had no idea that something like this would ever exist. I think there is a process of, I think, both education there on both sides, from the company itself, but also with the regulator to explain, what is this? What is it analogous to? And then it's our job, I think, as lawyers to try to explain, well, in the context of state money transmission rules, maybe cryptocurrency isn't money transmission, but is, a stable coin is very similar to stored balance or something like that, right? So I think part of it is what companies like Gemini, and it's very hard to do when you're at the bleeding edge of this new technology, all that they want is certainty. And I think companies like Gemini, which waited until the company was actually licensed and regulated and overseen by New York's Department of Financial Services, there is a desire to do things the right way and to create trust and certainty around this trustless and sort of scary asset. So I think to your question, part of it is certainty. Another part of it is flexibility, because a lot of companies like Gemini that try to go in the front door, they're competing with companies that are, snake oil salesmen and aren't taking the time to build an AML policy or to really conduct good identity verification. And so part of what I think regulators will struggle with in this new emerging technology is how do you create certainty for those who want to play by the rules and make it easy for them, because it's much easier not to play by the rules and do something that doesn't internalize all the cost of trying to be compliant. And then I think as a corollary to that, really making sure that there's strong enforcement against those who aren't coming in the front door, because you haven't really seen that. So I think the SEC has been a little bit, they've had more enforcement space, but I think from the state, and this is my own ignorance here, I don't know the extent to which state regulators have really been coming down on players who haven't gone through the front door in the cryptocurrency space. But that's one thing that gives companies who do want to take seriously all of the concerns that you mentioned about consumer protection. It gives confidence to companies like Gemini, I think, who want to do the right thing, that others are discouraged from doing bad things.
And real quick, just from an education technology perspective, I'm not sure you would know the answer, but is there a software you would recommend to analyze transactions on the blockchain, like Chainalysis, Elliptic, or CipherTrace? Are any of those familiar to you and better than the other one?
Those are the top three. When I was at Square, we used Chainalysis. When I came to Gemini, we started using Chainalysis, but then pivoted to Elliptic. I'm actually not sure why. I think those are, and then CipherTrace I've heard of, but actually don't have any personal experience with. But yeah, I think those are, at least the first two are the first two that pop to mind for me as well.
Awesome, thank you.